Before we begin, a quick message from our sponsor.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will even distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more other platforms. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. There's everything you need in a podcast in one place. So go ahead and download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hello, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the World Today podcast. This episode, we have a very special guest. She is a senator, and her name is Senator Wanda Bernard. Senator Wanda Bernard, how are you doing today?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
So, tell us about yourself.
So, a little bit about who I am. I'm a senator from Nova Scotia. My background is social work. So, I was a social worker. I have been a social worker for the past 40 plus years. I used to work in direct practice in mental health and community practice before I went into teaching. I taught social work at Dalhousie University School of Social Work for about 25 plus years, and I was director for 10 of those years.
Wow, that's really impressive.
And I was teaching social work when I was appointed to the Senate.
I see. So, what is it like serving as a senator?
When I think about that question, what is it like serving as a senator, the first thing that really comes to my mind is the responsibility. Senators represent all Canadians. And as a person of African descent, I know that other people of African descent across the country look to me for support, for guidance, for direction, for advice, and also, to be a person that will represent their interest in the Senate. So I often feel this great sense of responsibility as a senator.
I understand. So, being a senator, you're faced with a lot of challenges. So, what is the most challenging part of being a senator?
I would say that the most challenging part is just that, knowing that you're there representing the voices of others. I try to bring a social justice lens to the work and also a race equity lens, and sort of doing that in regards to the legislation that we're responsible for considering. I try to bring that to all of the legislation, and it can be challenging. It really can be challenging sometimes.
Absolutely. So, now our next question is, how has a recent world event influenced your perspective on life?
I don't know if there's a recent world event that's influenced my perspective on life. I would say that a previous world event so I would identify two world events that sort of have really greatly influenced me. So one would be the whole feminist movement, and then more recently, the Me Too movement. So those realities certainly help inform my work and my perspectives. But also, I'm a child of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, for sure.
And the civil rights movement, I would say, has greatly influenced me. And out of that movement, more recently, Black Lives Matter influenced my perspective on most things in life, really. In terms of recent events, I would say violence. So the recent shooting of the plane in Iran, the impact of that being felt here in Canada, but also around the world. That's a concern, but it also, for me, sort of epitomizes issues of violence that we are dealing with in our society, in our world. So sort of thinking about violence globally, but also locally as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on this because, like, I believe people resort to violence than diplomacy. Where the world is lacking diplomacy, and if we did have diplomacy, we wouldn't have all these problems and conflicts in our world.
That's right. Well, and I mentioned I mentioned the civil rights movement, and of course we've just recently celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and in celebrating that and reflecting on his life and his work, his message of peace and the efforts to end violence resonate even more today than they did when he was in the midst of it.
Yeah. So my next question is, who has been the single most important influential person in your life? It could be real or fictional character, and describe how his or her influence has helped or will help you shape your outlook on life.
That's a really, really difficult question because I've been influenced by a lot of people, and as I've just mentioned, I've been influenced by big movements. But then I thought, okay, let's distill that down. And if you were to identify one person that's had a significant impact on you and your life and your life's work, I would say for me, it really would be my mother.
Wow.
And I'll tell you the reason why. My mother was widowed at the age of 39 with 12 children.
12 children.
Yes, and the youngest was 18 months old. The oldest was 18 years old, and I was 12. And we were very, very poor. We were very poor. We were poor before our father died. So even more poor after he died. But when I think about how our mother kept us together, maintained her integrity, maintained her vision for us to do well, to be contributing members of society. When I think about how she sacrificed herself to help us launch as adults in the world, I would say that, that's been a significant influence on my life. And my mother worked as a domestic because that was the only job she could get because of the way in which education in her generation, there were segregated schools, and the segregated school in our community only went to grade 8. My mother wanted to be a teacher, but she was not able to realize that dream because the segregated school only went to grade 8. And if she did want to go to school in the neighboring city, but her parents would have had to pay, and her father wouldn't pay because he didn't believe that you had to educate young women. And so I think about the ways in which racism and sexism impacted her life, but I think about also how she rose above those challenges, how she worked so hard to make a difference. And she also contributed to her community, to her church, as well as, raising this very large family. I admire her strength.
Wow. She
And
sounds like an impressive woman.
she died about 14 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But when I think about her, and I often think about her when I'm facing those challenges I talked about earlier, and it's the memory of her doing so well with so little that helps me push through very challenging times. So that's why I would identify my mother as the single most significant
Wow.
in that broader context of movements being significant, but her specifically.
Okay. So let's go to our next question. And this question, it's really concerning is something that you know about and you could answer. So, what are some benefits of having a diverse society?
I would say the major benefit of having a diverse society is the fact that that when you have diversity in your society, in your community, you're bringing diverse perspectives and views and different expertise and opinions and so on. So I just think diversity makes our world, our organizations, our societies a bit more interesting and more intriguing, and brings us more opportunities.
For sure. So, having a diverse society also means a lot of people. So, what is your output on the current refugee crisis?
So I think that the current refugee crisis is a crisis that the world needs to just do better at addressing. When I think about, and I've met and talked with and know people who've lived in refugee camps. I remember meeting a young woman who literally had her whole education was through a refugee camp. And I think as a world, we can and should do better. We
Yeah,
must we must do better.
for sure. So, when Syrian refugees come to Canada, they are met with hostile people. What can we do to help combat the prejudice mindset some Canadians might have?
When I think about the discrimination that Syrian refugees and other refugees face, and other immigrants and other people who fall outside the mainstream in some way. When I think about that discrimination, oftentimes that discrimination is rooted in fear. It's rooted in a perception that if refugees are coming, they're taking something from the rest of us. This notion of, land is scarce, jobs are scarce, and so we tend to become more protectionist. We need to just educate Canadian society about the realities. We need to help demystify some of those realities. And
So, yeah,
if we were to address, some of the issues that we face within Canadian society, like issues of poverty, then I think that we would do better. We'd be more hospitable towards newcomers coming in, whether they're coming as refugees or immigrants.
for sure. I mean, people don't understand what refugees or immigrants go through, right? There's some things that are happening in their country and how they want to just ameliorate their living standards. And when they come to Canada, because we must be happy, we must be grateful that we're part of a great nation. We're living in the top 10%. Just by living in the Western Hemisphere, we're part of the top 10%. Some people are not like that, and we should be grateful. There's a quote from a book, I don't remember the name, but she said that it's an obligation for every person to be born who's born in a safer room to open the doors for a person that is not born in a safer room.
I'd like to find out who that quote is from because it sounds really powerful.
I read it in a book in my English class. My teacher was reading it to us because our current unit is on refugees.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So you can go back and find it.
For sure, I'll let you know.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so how can we fix the current refugee crisis?
I think we can fix the current refugee crisis by, as I said earlier, I think if we just create more education and awareness and also address some of the root causes that put people into positions where they feel this sense of fear of newcomers coming in. So I think if we do some work in that area in this country, I think we'd be more welcoming. We also, I think, need to break down some of the policy restrictions that make it impossible for refugees coming into Canada to work in the fields in which they were working in their home countries.
Yeah.
So I think if we look at some of those policy issues and address some of those policy issues, which make the whole transition to being in a new country for refugees.
Yeah, for sure. I've know this book, Immigrant City. It's by David Bismarck. Do you know that author?
Yes.
Yeah. So did you read his new book, Immigrant City?
No, I haven't seen that book. No.
So it's this new short story collection, and the first short story titled Immigrant City, there was this justice minister from Somalia who fled the country after the civil war. But when he came to Canada, he was neglected of his skills and his characteristics and his qualifications of being a justice minister. He could have helped the Canadian government fight and combat the issues in Somalia, but they just neglected him.
So they didn't recognize his qualifications or his
Exactly.
expertise.
And not
And
just him, there's just many other people. Like my dad was an engineer and he came to Canada. He first had to work in a store as a clerk, even though he was a qualified engineer with a master's degree.
that's the story of so many refugees that come to Canada. And that's on us as Canadians. We must address that. We must address those policies that don't recognize credentials
Yes.
from certain countries.
Yeah. So do you think Canada should continue to accept refugees? What I mean by that is we accept more refugees than America does. So do you think Canada should continue to accept more refugees or tell America to accept more refugees?
Well, I think that I can't speak for what should happen in America, but I think Canada certainly should continue to accept refugees, but also work harder and smarter in terms of making the spaces more welcoming for refugees to be able to fully embrace their new life here in Canada.
For sure. So Canada is a country known for accepting immigrants. We are called the nation of immigrants. But despite that, there has been a rise in hate crimes. And how can we prevent this from rising even more? I mean, if you look at the Quebec mass shooting, there were so many people, there were 19, I think, killed. And the perpetrator was, motivated by Canada's immigration policy. He did not like that. So what can we do to prevent this from happening?
Well, as I was saying earlier, so if we go back and look at systemic discrimination, systemic racism, systemic oppression, we really need to address those issues and educate broader society so that a lot of the hate is rooted in discrimination. And discrimination is rooted in a sense of difference being unequal. And so part of what needs to happen is what we do in education. How do we educate? How do we help people become more aware and break down those attitudes, break down those stereotypes, break down the unconscious bias, but also break down the conscious bias? So doing that hard work, having those difficult conversations, making those policy changes so that equality in Canada really means equality for all, not
Absolutely.
not just for some.
Yeah, we must respect Section 15 of the Canadian Charter.
Absolutely.
So, Mrs. Bernard, thank you so much for being on my podcast. I really appreciate it. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being on my podcast. It's been an honor.
Well, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I hope that you inspire some of your peers to engage in similar kinds of efforts because I think it's important. So thank you.
Thank you. And have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.